Hello again. Are you ready for our third lesson in 1 Thessalonians? In our last video we finished chapter 1. This lesson we're going to take the first verses of chapter 2 down through verse 12. And this is one of those divinely inspired rabbit trails I mentioned in the introduction to the last video. Paul seemingly digresses from thanksgiving for the Thessalonian church to a dissertation on the conduct of his team while they were there. The team's actions were originally brought up in chapter 1, verses 5 and 6, where he says, "As ye know what manner of men we were among you for your sake, and ye became followers of us." It was brought up as evidence of the power of the gospel. Remember, in first century Greek thought, a teacher whose teachings were worth following was worthy of being emulated. So the question arises, why take another 12 verses to elaborate on the team's actions? The first possibility for that is that Paul was defending their actions against some critic. This may be partially true. Paul and his teachings were under attack, however, not worth interrupting his thoughts on thanksgiving in just to make a defense against some people who were outside the church. So the second possibility comes from remembering the primary purpose of the letter was to encourage the Thessalonians, and also the purpose of all of Paul's letters to have that of encouraging godly living. Paul was holding his team up as examples of how Christians should act, especially church leaders. So let's reread the last two verses of chapter 1 to kind of lead us into what we're going to talk about in chapter 2. "For they themselves show of us what manner of entering in we had unto you, and how you turned to God from idols to serve the living and true God, and to wait for his Son from heaven, whom he raised from the dead, even Jesus, which delivered us from the wrath to come." Paul commended the Thessalonian Christians for turning from idols to serve God and to wait for Christ's return. As we go into chapter 2, Paul says, "This is the manner of life you ought to live to serve God. Look at the example we gave you. Emulate it." So now let's pick up the first couple of verses of chapter 2. "For yourselves, brethren, know our entrance in unto you, that it was not in vain. But even after that we had suffered before, and were shamefully entreated, as ye know, at Philippi, we were bold in our God to speak unto you the gospel of God with much contention." The word "for" here connects what he's saying here in these two verses with what he said in verse 9 in particular at the end of chapter 1. There he mentioned the manner of their entering in, and here he says, "our entrance in unto you." He first phrases what he's going to say in negative terms. It was not in vain. Vain translates a Greek word meaning ineffective, worthless, or useless. It wasn't a failure. It wasn't empty. It was full. Then Paul states the positive. "We were bold in our God to speak unto you the gospel of God." Remember our discussion from chapter 1 of the gospel and the power that it has. So he's saying, in spite of all the things trying to keep us from spreading the true gospel, we were bold. We dared to speak the truth. Then in verse 2 he mentions that they were abused in Philippi. Remember, Paul and Silas were beaten and thrown in jail in Philippi. And in Thessalonica they were greeted with contention and eventually driven out of Thessalonica and even out of Berea, clear out of Macedonia, for preaching the gospel. In order to present the gospel, they had to struggle against all these opposing forces. In the face of this, they were bold. They dared to speak the truth anyway. The implied argument is that the gospel message itself was powerful enough to change the lives of those who believed and acted on it. It wasn't a failure. It wasn't empty. It was worth the struggle to present a message that changes lives. As we go on, verses 3 through 6 will repeat this formula of stating something in the negative and then turning and stating the positive. Then in verses 7 through 11, Paul's going to switch to a list of positives only. And then lastly in verse 12, he states the objective for their actions. So let's pick up and read verses 3 through 6. For our exhortation was not of deceit, nor of uncleanness, nor in guile. But as we were allowed of God to be put in trust with the gospel, even so we speak, not as pleasing men, but God, which trieth our hearts. For neither at any time used we flattering words, as ye know, nor a cloak of covetousness, God is witness. Nor of men sought we glory, neither of you, nor yet of others, when we might have been burdensome as the apostles of Christ. The negatives in these verses are all things that a person seeking his own benefit would do. The positives all show how what they did was the opposite of what the deceitful person would do. So in verse 3, Paul states three things. Their exhortation was not, notice the prepositions, not of deceit, not of uncleanness, not in guile. The first two refer to the source of the exhortation, and the third refers to its presentation. Its source was not erroneous, nor was it born of impure motive. Its presentation was not crafty. Probably the only term that needs some explanation is the second one. It was not of uncleanness. Uncleanness usually refers to sexual immorality, but here it undoubtedly refers to greed and corruption. So, verse 4, the evidence they weren't doing what was described in verse 3. On the contrary, the source of the exhortation was God himself. God trusted Paul and his team to take the gospel to the Thessalonians. The two of statements. Paul uses the negative, positive again to prove the last preposition, the manner of the presentation, the in statement. Because God is the source, the gospel is not intended to be pleasing to men. It is intended to be pleasing to God, who tries our hearts. Again, the implied argument that comes from this is that it would be foolish to betray the trust that God put in them, because God is an all-knowing judge of men's hearts. God's empowerment of the message proves they were true to the calling. A couple of applications come to mind here. What is the motive of our service for God? Are we truly focused only on being true to God and his calling in our lives? What do you see in others? And I don't ask that for the purpose of judging their motives, but rather, what ministers should we attach ourselves to and support? Have you ever seen the gospel preached deceitfully? I have. There was a guy many years ago now called Reverend Ike who used to preach a gospel of send me money and I'll pray for you and everything will be fine. He got a lot of money, but I don't think he changed too many other people's lives. In verse 5, he says, we did not use flattery. In modern English, we usually take flattery to mean say nice things about people to gain their favor. But here it means tailoring truth to fit popular opinion. It's the opposite of the boldness mentioned in verse 2. In verse 2, they were bold to speak even in the face of opposition. If you're going to be flattering, like he's talking about here in verse 5, you would change the truth so that you wouldn't meet all that opposition. You would change the truth to tell people what they wanted to hear. Paul says that is not what we did. We did not use flattery. We did not change the truth. We preached it the way it should be. And he says, you, Thessalonians, are the witnesses that we didn't change the words to fit popular opinion. Now, then he says they didn't cloak or mask the true gospel in order to gain anything from the Thessalonians. This time, he calls God as the witness. Only God sees our motivation, and so only God can judge that argument that Paul makes there. Then in verse 6, the next argument, they didn't seek glory, meaning praise, from the church or anyone else. They could have rightly held themselves up as apostles and expected some respect and acclamation or honor, and that would imply the Thessalonian church should offer financial support. They did not make any claim to their apostleship. looking for honor, looking for any support, because they didn't want to be a burden to this young church. Now let's pick up in verse 7. But we were gentle among you, even as a nurse cherisheth her children. So, being affectionately desirous of you, we were willing to have imparted unto you, not the gospel of God only, but also our own souls, because ye were dear unto us. For ye remember, brethren, our labor and travail, for laboring night and day, because we would not be chargeable unto any of you, we preached unto you the gospel of God. Ye are witnesses, and God also, how holily and justly and unblameably we behaved ourselves among you that believe, as ye know how we exhorted and comforted and charged every one of you, as a father doth his children. Now we switch to the purely positive arguments. So let's again take it verse by verse. Verse 7, he says, we were as gentle as a nursing mother is with her babies. There's no stronger emotional tie nor gentler care given than that given in the relationship of a mother to her baby. As the missionaries presented the gospel, they were that gentle. I wonder, are we that gentle with the lost? In verse 8 he says, we were affectionately desirous of you. He harkens back to the picture of a mother and her baby. The team was not only motivated to share the gospel, but to share themselves, their own lives with the Thessalonian church. They were that dear to them. Ministers of the gospel can't afford to be standoffish, and they won't be able to accomplish the work of the ministry in the lives of their converts. Are we willing to pour out our lives into new converts? See, that's really what discipleship is. Discipleship isn't just teaching people some introductory doctrine. It's pouring ourselves into them and teaching them and training them and loving them along till they become mature Christians. In verse 9, Paul and his team took jobs and supported themselves so as not to be a financial burden on this new church. Understand, in that society, you had to work 12 hours a day just to get enough food and enough money to have food and shelter. So they worked all day at some secular jobs and then ministered to the church at night. I really wonder how hard we're willing to work to reach the lost and disciple converts. That's quite an example, to work 12 hours and then do the ministry at night. In verse 10, Paul calls on both the Thessalonians and God as witnesses of their conduct. He says it was holy, just, and unblameable. Holy and just, or righteous, refer to keeping the laws of God and man. Unblameable, or as we now say, blameless, means that there was nothing that they did that could in any way be considered as an act that was unholy or unjust. Can we say our actions are always holy and just to the extent that no one can lay any blame at our feet? I wonder about that one. In verse 11, there's a contrast, or not a contrast, it's verse 7 was gentle as a nursing mother, and here we're going to see in verse 11 a loving, good father. The Thessalonians are the witnesses. Paul's team encouraged, comforted, and implored the new Christians. A good father implores or teaches his children proper behavior, and then he encourages and comforts them along life's way so that they grow to be mature citizens. That's the same idea of discipling the Christian converts to become mature Christians. Notice the phrase, he says, every one of you. They didn't act as a father to the church en masse. They dealt with every individual, giving each the teaching, encouragement, and comfort that that individual needed. Are you willing to be a father to a baby Christian? Let's read verse 12. That ye would walk worthy of God, who hath called you unto his kingdom and glory. Why did the missionaries do all the things that they did? They did them so that the Thessalonians would live lives that were worthy of the God that they had turned from idols to serve. Paul reminds them again of the special place they have in God. Are we walking worthy of God? Let me give you some application. While intending to encourage the Thessalonians, the verses we studied in this lesson were also intended to instruct them in godly living. They have that same application to us today. Do we treat the lost with the gentleness of a nursing mother? Do we treat a new Christian with that same affection? Are we willing to invest ourselves in their lives, to be a father to them? Lastly, let me just ask, why do you serve God?